Hello and welcome to the Real News Network. I'm your host and climate change correspondent, Aman Azhar. Joining me today is Steve Kaii-Ziegler. He's planning and zoning officer with Arundel County, and we're going to be talking about some of the weather events and what that means for the city infrastructure and planning. Steve, thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
So to begin with, we're seeing some increasingly hostile weather events, such as the hurricanes, as in the case with Texas, Louisiana, and of course the wildfires, as we are seeing in California. Now, just to be sure and to be on the same page on this, are these wider patterns that link into the climate change events, and what does it really mean for our cities?
I believe so. Historically, we've always had severe weather events, whether they're hurricanes, typhoons, large fires. They have always happened. But I think what we're seeing in more recent decades is an expansion in both the frequency and the intensity of those storms. And they play very much into the modeling that climate change scientists have been using to try and predict what we're going to be seeing in the next few decades.
Right. So in terms of Maryland, do you see any of the, what is it symptomatic of? Do you see any patterns told that these events are taking on our cities? What cost are we paying?
I think we're paying an infrastructure cost and having to replace existing infrastructure. Let's use Ellicott City as an example. Several years ago, within a 2 or 3 year period of time, there were two catastrophic storm events that basically moved an enormous amount of water into downtown Ellicott City. There has been a major program in Howard County, Ellicott City, to have to replace that infrastructure. That is many millions of dollars. And it's not that these storms never happened in the past, but we're seeing an increase in the frequency and again in the intensity. From a government perspective, we're in charge of dealing with stormwater management regulations. They come out of the Maryland Department of the Environment. The local jurisdictions implement them. And while those standards have been significantly increased over time, we're finding they're insufficient to deal with these massive storm events that we've been having recently. And we're also predicting that the frequency of those storms and their severity will continue to grow into the future.
So how do we plug those inadequacies in terms of city planning and, of course, infrastructure, which is going to be needed in terms of safeguarding and mitigation?
Great question. There's something that happened in the Maryland legislation in the last year, and it's ended up being Senate Bill 457, and it allows local jurisdictions that have a population base of 30,000 people or more to develop their own, I'm going to say, resiliency authorities. That gives local jurisdictions the ability to create government-like units that have the ability to generate fees and taxes necessary to better plan for these events and to set aside money for capital facilities that are better able to deal with those storm events. In Anne Arundel County, working with the city of Annapolis in the last year, we helped push that legislation through. It was adopted by the Senate in May of this year. This fall, I'm going to say Anne Arundel County government working with the city of Annapolis will be working on joint legislation that will enable that state legislation to be impacted or implemented at the local level. Haven't seen what that legislation looks like yet. I'm looking forward to being able to participate in it. But the idea is to create a foundation where we can better plan for and then collect or extract money necessary to deal with these very large storm events that relate to climate change.
And would you make me understand a little bit more in terms of the city and then the state and then the federal government? Of course, there are so many of the layers involved and so much of red tapeism involved. So do you see that this is going to be kind of something or a matrix that's going to be adopted nationwide in terms of states and cities and the federal government? If you could give me a little bit of an indication so we can understand this, how it's going to progress.
I think so. I think Maryland's kind of the tip of the spear, along with some things I'm seeing in Rhode Island, where we're setting the precedent where this type of organizational structure has to be set up because the traditional government structure simply can't address this the way that most governments are organized. So yeah, I think we're establishing the blueprint that other states and perhaps the federal government can use as we look at how we're going to deal with climate change in the future. Pretty excited.
Right, and we do know that in terms of the federal government and some certain other states, that climate change and the science surrounding it is it's quite controversial. So how do we kind of cut through that kind of a wall that we keep hitting and kind of get around this problem which we're dealing with today and yesterday?
Well, at the local level, I'm saying at the state, there is clearly an awareness and understanding that climate change is a real thing and that we need to start planning for it and how we do all the work that we do. At a local level, for example, Arundel County, it's a community of about 600,000 people. It's where Annapolis is. We have BWI, an international airport. We have Fort Meade. We're kind of a big, powerful place. And what we try to do is at the time that every year we adopt a 6-year capital improvement program, we've now built in, I'm going to say it's informal, but it's real criteria in how we review where and how we spend public money for infrastructure projects. And so we're building in climate change criteria as to where that would be. As an example would be, do we want to continue resurfacing a road that we know in 20 years will be completely underwater? That may not make sense in the long run. If we have to build a new school, should we build it in a place that we believe is maybe underwater or adjacent to a river or stream that's subject to a very large storm, may be inundated by it? So I think at the local level, meaning the county, the city, we're starting to take this very seriously. What I'm really thrilled is at the state level, our legislators determined that there was enough interest and a warrant to move forward with creating this legislation that then allows local jurisdictions to have a much bigger say in how we plan and deal with the issue.
So in terms of the timeline, what kind of a timeline are we working with? Because like we're seeing at the moment with the kind of Hurricane Laura and the wildfires, that the challenge is really today, and as I said yesterday. So in terms of these instruments that we are creating and in terms of getting all the money that is going to be needed, and of course, then the whole kind of getting around the infrastructure and getting down to nuts and bolts, what kind of a timeline, Steve, do you think we're working with here?
That's hard to predict, but I will say in Arundel County with the administration I work with Stuart Pittman, the county executive, we're taking this as seriously as we possibly can. We were instrumental in getting the state legislation to adopt 457, which allowed us to move forward. That's the first step. That just became law in May. This fall, we'll be introducing, is my understanding, local legislation. We call it, we got enabling legislation from the state. Now we have to do our own at the local level, and it will be a joint effort between the city of Annapolis and Anne Arundel County. First thing is we have to have the legislation that allows us to move forward. Then we have all the nuts and bolts of creating an authority, staffing it, what type of financing structure we need to build, and all of that needs to be developed and then approved by a county council and a city council. Hard to predict how long that will take. It will be a political process. The public will be very, very involved, and I'm sure there'll be lots of different points of view on how that should happen.
Right, and I think one very important, and correct me if I'm wrong, important piece is public awareness of these events. Do you think that kind of a due share is being put in terms of making people aware that these events, even if they're not today not happening in our backyard, might be happening somewhere else quite close by, and they will have a ripple effects and they impact us. Pandemic, of course, is one such event as well. And then these hurricanes and storms. So do you think that enough planning is also kind of going into making the public aware so they're equipped with the essential skills and awareness of these events?
I'm going to say not yet. There is a tremendous effort to educate and train, I'm going to say professional people who will have to deal with, and that occurs in Maryland through a unique organization, the Climate Change Academy. And that's easy to look up. It's a program I went through about a year ago, fabulously informative, educational, and helping, I'm going to say, people engaged in land planning, so, environmental scientists understand the issue. Has it trickled out into the masses? Not yet. And that is something that does need to be done. One of the things we do as practicing land planners is we now build for every person that we're trying to recruit for a vacant position. We build in criteria in our job announcements. We're looking for people who have an understanding and awareness and interest in climate change. We're also building it into the way that we evaluate the staff. It's typically you have a certain number of applications you might review. We're plans you're working on. We're now trying to build, at least to a degree, evaluation criteria that deals with climate change. So to the extent we're able to influence those we have some control of, we're doing a good job. At the upper levels of government, they're very aware, they're working hard. What hasn't trickled out, for example, I think in the public school system or to the average citizen in Anne Arundel County or the state, is a true awareness of the implications of climate change. And we've got to do a better job of that as we move forward.
Also, while we're talking, could you recount some of the costs which are associated with these climate events that you've seen in Maryland or where you are that are worthy of knowing and kind of not losing sight of?
It's a little harder in Maryland because most of the cost structuring I've looked at has been on military bases that have been inundated with a large storm or hurricane or something else. But, Ellicott City lost many millions of dollars in infrastructure, meaning the streets, certain private property, public property, and the cost to go in and repair something multiple times is extraordinarily expensive. We sometimes forget, and I like to use as an example, the United States military has a number of very large bases in the continental United States and overseas. And some of our larger bases in the last 5 years, I'm keeping track of, Tyndale Air Force Base, which is in Florida, Air Force Base, had a hurricane. They had to move a lot of aircraft away from the base, but they couldn't fly them all out. And the base was basically destroyed. My understanding is the rough price tag to repair, rebuild that base is $5 billion. And one of the things I would ask is, what does $5 billion get you if you didn't have to spend it again and again and again? So the cost to deal with climate change, the very large storms, the hurricanes, the brush fires in California, it's not all about water events, it's all kinds of things, is astronomical. And we're not prepared yet to deal with these events in the best way possible. That's still to come. There's an enormous amount of education and planning that's still ahead of us.
Right. So if we were to start, where should we place our bets in terms of the first steps or first initial few steps?
Education. Education. We've got to help our citizens understand the order of magnitude. As you are aware, not everybody believes in climate change or global warming. And there's a sizable amount of our population who truly believes it's nonsense. I've come to the conclusion separately that it's not nonsense. There is so much, there's astronomical amounts of data that support that while these events have occurred throughout our history, they're occurring in increasingly fast and more severe, and that trend is going to continue until we start dealing with it. So, it's gonna affect all of us. We had a test run to a degree. We have not been spending a lot of time in the last 6 months on climate change because we've been dealing with COVID. And to a degree, COVID is a runner-up, in my opinion, to some of the things that we're going to have to be dealing with climate change. Climate change affects infrastructure. It affects private property rights. It affects our health. It affects the vulnerable population to a much higher degree than it does, I'm going to say, the more affluent or privileged. COVID had that same effect, and we're still dealing with it, and not necessarily really well. So I think so much of it starts with education, and there almost has to be a national interest in doing it. Some administrations might be willing to do that, others might not. But I think that's the most important thing for now. Next thing I think is for local governments to take the lead, working with their state partners and establishing these resiliency authorities so that we can officially start planning for these events and starting to, I'm going to say, generate revenue so that we can physically deal with some of them. Those are the two first things we need to do.
So would I be right in saying that you're actually kind of pointing out that this is almost like a rethink of the phrase we often hear, like national security paradigm?
It's related to national security. I think so. And when we think about COVID, there's a connection with COVID and climate change that's interesting. My office, we have 71 positions. We are teleworking 90% of the time, which means my staff doesn't have to get in their car twice a day to drive to and from work. And everybody is in kind of the same boat. So there are typically far less vehicles on the road. We probably noticed this in one way, shape, or form because most of us can work from home now. That's had an added benefit, and it's a good thing related to climate change, is we're producing less particulate matter into the air. Our air is cleaner now. It's kind of funny that we've reduced congestion and we've improved air quality. Now those are the positive things that come out of COVID. And it's not to say it's worth COVID, but it's interesting to see that this virus has caused us to change our behavior and work patterns significantly. That can have a pretty profound impact on how we deal with climate change. And we're learning these things as we go along. I like that we're learning from this.
Right. And for the benefit of understanding a little bit more, what kind of infrastructural needs are we going to have in terms of dealing with these weather events and freak weather conditions going forward?
Sure. We're going to have to armor our shorelines where population centers occur. There's a plan in place to do that in the city of Annapolis at the dock area combined with the U.S. Naval Academy. That makes sense to do. You'll see a similar thing in Baltimore over time. So where you have large population centers, you're going to spend a lot of money on building infrastructure, seawalls, to try and protect population centers. But it's also going to affect where we have to decide not to spend money. We don't want to build a school in an area that's vulnerable. We don't want to go into a residential community or create new residential or commercial areas in areas that we know will flood. So it's going to affect dramatically how we spend our limited infrastructure dollars in a very material way. Like I said, we have to protect the population centers, but if you think about it, we have lots and lots and lots of people who live on fairly large lots adjacent to rivers, streams, and the shoreline. As sea level rises, it's going to imperil at least some of those. And if it does, do we go in and rebuild in the same place that we did? And those are questions that, our future folks will have to decide. My take is we probably won't. I think you're going to see huge changes in the way that we regulate development. It hasn't happened yet, but people are thinking about it. Do we let people build in a 100-year floodplain? Or is the answer no? Do we need stronger land use regulations in these more vulnerable areas? And I would say we do. And as more and more events occur, like what happened in Elkridge, it's going to impact our decision making. City of Annapolis has a thing called nuisance flooding. You've probably all seen pictures where it's a sunny day and all of downtown is underwater. And that's a result of tidal influences coming up through the stormwater system. You don't have to have big storms to create a major event anymore. Simply that sea level is rising. So it's going to be interesting, but I think the smart people, and I'm fortunate to get to participate with a lot of them, recognize the problem, are starting to take the steps, and I can't underestimate the relative importance of helping educate all of our citizens to the reality of this. Everybody got a dose of education through COVID. And climate change is going to be a much longer event and thing that we have to deal with than hopefully we'll deal with COVID.
And I think my last question would be, in your understanding, where could the challenges to this kind of needs and necessities, which are almost needed for the survival, going to come from? Because, of course, the bureaucratic red tapeism is one which is a big bump always in the road to such kind of planning needs and need for the money, for that matter. And, of course, politics, which can present itself as a challenge as well going forward. So are there anything else to add to the list?
Yeah, I think, everything you said resonated, and it also scares me with the challenge ahead, because I think one of the things, maybe the most important thing to remember, is that a very large percentage of our population is vulnerable for a whole host of, whether it's economic, social, health issues, and much of the vulnerable population also reside in areas that are most vulnerable for sea level rise. And I think it's going to be quite a challenge to help those communities when there are catastrophic events coming that will influence whether or not they can stay in their homes. Do we invest in providing, as an example, I might have a community that lives near the shore, and they have failing septic systems, and it's been there for 50 years, but there's, I'm only using this as an example, maybe 100 homes. Does the county go in and provide public sewer and water to replace those failing septics if we know in 10, 20, 30 years it's most likely to be underwater? And that's going to be a very, very tough issue to deal with that community. And it will happen, I think, over and over and over throughout this country. And so, you know, hopefully we're going to be able to educate folks, help them, but, you know, we're going to have to work with everybody to work through this. Climate change is real, it's coming, it's going to influence everything, but at the end of the day, it's a challenge that I think we can overcome if we're willing to work with each other. Right now, we're seeing some things that would give me pause as to whether or not that's possible, but I'm still hopeful that, that we have the ability as humans to treat us respectfully as we try and help each other.
I can't resist but asking, is there anything that the communities can do in addition to what our offices are doing to kind of safeguard against these challenges, enormous that they are?
Sure. One is to be aware. Check with your local planning office, whether city or county. We have, I'm going to say, climate change forecast maps, and you have my email address. Anybody can email me. But we can do a little bit of research for any individual who asks, and that helps you know what we're anticipating climate change or sea level rise impact on your individual piece of property. I probably get 1 or 2 requests for that information every month. We're glad to help. The other thing is, as an individual, start becoming interested and educate yourself. If you need help with materials, contact us. We're always glad to help. Do a quick Google search of the Climate Change Academy. It's open to anybody, and I believe it's still free courses. It's 6 full days of basically classroom teaching and probably 3 days of homework, but it was one of the best experiences and most educational, value education that I've ever been through. But I think a lot of this is going to be, at the end of the day, individuals taking responsibility for themselves, and there's a lot people can do for themselves. The government is, you know, it sounds weird when I say we're here to help, but this is a very different time. Nobody expected COVID to happen, if you think about it. We're adjusting to it. It's difficult. We'll get through it. And climate change is going to offer as many opportunities as problems.
Complicated and complex subject. Thank you once again, Steve, for taking our time and speaking with us and sharing all this information.
Thank you for having me.
And thanks also to our audiences for tuning in. You can always look us up at therealnews.com. For myself and the rest of the team for now, it's goodbye and be well.